The end did not begin at the walls of Urgench. It began far to the east, in a moment that seemed at the time manageable, a decision made within the authority of a governor, a suspicion acted upon without hesitation. A caravan stopped, its goods seized, its merchants accused, the men executed. In isolation, it was an assertion of control. Within the political logic of the Khwarazmian Empire, it was not unusual. Frontier officials were expected to act decisively. Trade routes were monitored, and threats, real or imagined, were eliminated before they could take shape. But this was not a local matter. The caravan belonged to the empire of Genghis Khan, and what followed was not immediate retaliation, but something far more dangerous: restraint. Envoys were sent. Not soldiers, not raiders. Envoys. Their purpose was not conquest, but explanation. The Mongol leader demanded accountability, not submission. The governor responsible for the killings, stationed at Otrar, had acted without authorization. The empire could correct this. It could repair the breach. What returned instead was silence, then defiance. The envoys themselves were humiliated. One was executed. The others were sent back disfigured, stripped not only of dignity, but of the assumption that diplomacy would be respected. At that moment, the structure of the conflict changed. This was no longer a dispute over trade or authority. It became a question of legitimacy. An empire that could not protect envoys, could not acknowledge diplomatic norms, was not simply hostile. It was, in Mongol perception, fundamentally unreliable, unstable, something to be removed. The Khwarazmian Empire, under Muhammad II of Khwarazm, did not fully grasp the scale of the reaction it had triggered. It was a large empire, stretching across Central Asia, encompassing cities of immense wealth: Samarkand, Bokhara, Urgench. Its population was vast, its trade networks deeply integrated into the Silk Road. Its rulers had dealt with nomadic threats before. Raids were common. Steppe armies appeared and disappeared. They did not dismantle entire states. But the Mongol campaign that followed was not a raid. It was a system. When Mongol forces began moving west, they did so with coordination that suggested prior planning. Multiple columns advanced simultaneously, not converging immediately, but spreading across the geography of the empire. This was not disorder. It was distribution. Each force had a role, each movement a purpose. Cities fell not because they were weak, but because they were isolated. The Khwarazmian leadership responded in a way that, under normal circumstances, would have been rational. Instead of concentrating their army into a single field force, they dispersed it. Garrisons were reinforced. Cities were expected to hold independently. The logic was clear: deny the invader quick victories, force prolonged sieges, exhaust the attacker. But this approach assumed something about the Mongols that was not true. It assumed they required time. Instead, Mongol forces moved with a speed that disrupted every defensive calculation. They bypassed strongholds, appeared where they were not expected, and coordinated attacks across distances that should have prevented synchronization. Intelligence moved faster than armies. Messages were relayed through a system of riders that allowed strategic decisions to adapt in real time. Cities that believed themselves secure discovered that they were not targets of opportunity, but planned objectives. Bokhara fell, then Samarkand. Each collapse was not simply a loss of territory, but a fracture in the psychological structure of the empire. News traveled unevenly, often distorted, but consistent in one aspect. Resistance did not produce negotiation. It produced annihilation. For soldiers stationed in distant garrisons, this created a new kind of pressure. They were no longer defending a border. They were waiting for confirmation that the system they relied on, walls, reinforcements, command structure, was still intact. Waiting for orders that became increasingly unclear as communication lines fractured. Waiting for an enemy that did not behave predictably. Urgench, the capital of the Khwarazmian Empire, became the final concentration point of these pressures. Located along the Amu Darya, it was not only a political center, but an economic one. Trade routes converged here. Wealth accumulated here. Its defenses were formidable, its population large. It was not a frontier city. It was the core, and it was here that the empire would make its last stand. By the time Mongol forces approached Urgench in 1221, The strategic situation had already deteriorated beyond recovery. Muhammad II of Khwarazm had retreated, abandoning coordinated resistance in favor of survival. His movements became erratic, his authority increasingly disconnected from the cities that still bore his name. This absence of centralized command created a vacuum inside Urgench. Leadership did not disappear, but it fragmented. Military commanders, local elites, and remaining officials operated within overlapping chains of authority, none of which could fully assert control over the others. Decisions were made, but not always aligned. Resources were allocated, but not always efficiently. And yet, the city prepared for siege. Fortifications were reinforced. Supplies were gathered. Civilians were drawn inside the walls, increasing the population density, and, with it, the strain on provisions. Soldiers were positioned along defensive lines, aware that retreat was no longer an option. But even before the first Mongol units reached the outskirts, uncertainty had already begun to erode cohesion. Rumors spread faster than instructions. Some spoke of cities that had resisted and been spared. Others described total destruction. Populations eliminated, infrastructure dismantled, survivors relocated or enslaved. These conflicting accounts did not clarify the situation. They destabilized it. For the defenders, this created a psychological dilemma. If resistance led to annihilation, surrender might offer survival. But if surrender led to execution, as it occurred elsewhere, then resistance became the only rational choice. The inability to determine which outcome was more likely meant that decisions were made under conditions of incomplete information. This was not confusion in the sense of disorder. It was structured uncertainty, and it shaped every action that followed. When Mongol forces began to encircle Urgench, they did not immediately assault the walls. They observed, positioning themselves along key approaches. They cut off external supply lines, isolating the city not only physically but informationally. Movement in and out became impossible. Communication with other regions ceased. The city was now a closed system. Inside, time began to change. Days were no longer measured by routine, but by anticipation. Each sunrise brought the possibility of attack. Each night extended the uncertainty. The defenders remained in position, but the absence of immediate assault created its own tension. Why wait? For the Mongols, the delay was not hesitation. It was calculation. Urgench presented a different kind of challenge compared to earlier cities. Its terrain, interwoven with canals, waterways, and dense urban structures, limited the effectiveness of cavalry maneuvers that had defined previous victories. The open field advantages of the Mongol army were reduced here. Adaptation was required, and adaptation took time. Engineering units were brought forward. Siege equipment was assembled. Plans were adjusted to account for the urban complexity of the target. This was not an army improvising under pressure. It was an army reconfiguring its methods to ensure that when the assault came, it would not fail. Inside the city, this pause was interpreted in multiple ways. Some saw it as weakness. If the Mongols were delaying, perhaps they were uncertain. Perhaps the city's defenses were stronger than expected. Confidence, fragile as it was, found brief reinforcement in the absence of attack. Others interpreted it differently. They saw the pattern that had already unfolded across the empire. Cities were not spared because they resisted effectively. They were destroyed after being isolated, studied, and then dismantled with precision. For these observers, the silence outside the walls was not reassurance. It was preparation. And beneath this tension, a deeper structural issue remained unresolved. There was no unified command. Without a central authority capable of coordinating defense across all sectors of the city, responses to the evolving situation became inconsistent. Some commanders advocated for aggressive sorties, attempts to disrupt Mongol preparations before they were complete. Others argued for strict defense, conserving resources and avoiding unnecessary losses. Neither approach was fully implemented. Instead, actions were partial, limited, insufficient to alter the broader trajectory. As Mongol preparations advanced, the imbalance became clearer. This was not simply a siege. It was the final stage of a campaign that had already dismantled the empire's capacity to respond effectively. Urgench was not being attacked in isolation. It was being eliminated as the last remaining center of resistance. The walls still stood. The defenders still held their positions. But the conditions that made those defenses meaningful had already begun to disappear. And outside the city, the Mongol army completed its preparations. The waiting was ending. When the assault began, it did not resemble the earlier collapses of Bokhara or Samarkand. There was no rapid breach, no sudden disintegration of resistance. Urgench forced the Mongols into a different kind of war. The city's geography disrupted their usual methods. Canals cut through defensive sectors, dividing movement into narrow channels. Dense urban construction restricted visibility. Cavalry, normally the decisive arm of Mongol warfare, could not maneuver freely within this environment. The speed and fluidity that had defined earlier victories were now constrained by physical space. This did not halt the Mongols. It forced them to change. The army assembled outside Urgench was not a single unified mass. It was divided among the sons of Genghis Khan, Joki, Chagatai, and Ogdi, each commanding their own contingents, each operating within the broader objective of reducing the city. But unity of purpose did not always produce unity of command. Tensions existed between the princes, particularly between Joki and Chagatai. Their rivalry was not only personal but strategic. Joki, who had been assigned operations in the western regions, was inclined toward a more measured approach. Chagatai favored direct pressure, decisive action that would end resistance quickly. At Urgench, this disagreement became operational. Time was not neutral. Every delay allowed the defenders to reinforce positions, to adapt, to resist longer than expected. Yet an uncontrolled assault risked unnecessary losses in terrain that favored defense. This friction did not paralyze the Mongol command, but it shaped the pace and structure of the siege. The solution that emerged was systematic escalation. The first phase was not the storming of walls, but their weakening. Siege engines were brought forward. Catapults and traction trebuchets constructed with materials sourced from the surrounding region. Engineers, many of them drawn from earlier conquered territories, were integrated into the Mongol force. They understood urban fortifications. They understood how to dismantle them. Bombardment began. Stones were hurled against the outer defenses, not with the expectation of immediate collapse, but with the intention of cumulative damage. Sections of wall were targeted repeatedly. Towers were struck to reduce their structural integrity. Defensive positions were forced to shift under constant pressure. Inside the city, this changed the nature of defense. The walls could no longer be treated as static barriers. They became active zones of risk. Soldiers stationed along them were exposed not only to projectiles, but to the possibility of sudden failure. Sections giving way without warning, collapsing under sustained impact. Repair efforts began immediately. Labor was organized to reinforce damaged areas, to fill breaches as they appeared. Timber supports were erected, rubble redistributed, defensive layers improvised. But every repair required time, and every repair was temporary. The Mongols did not aim to destroy the walls in a single moment. They aimed to exhaust the capacity to maintain them. At the same time, the encirclement tightened. No reinforcements arrived. No external relief force appeared on the horizon. The Khwarazmian Empire, as a functioning military structure, had already ceased to exist. What remained inside Urgench was isolated, left to operate without support, without coordination, without the expectation of rescue. This realization began to settle among the defenders. It did not produce immediate collapse. It produced endurance. The soldiers inside the city understood that their survival depended not on victory in the conventional sense, but on prolonging resistance. Every day held the possibility, however uncertain, that the Mongols might shift their attention elsewhere, that circumstances might change. But the Mongols did not withdraw. They adapted further. Assault units were formed for close-quarters operations. Infantry, often drawn from subject peoples within the Mongol system, were pushed forward toward weakened sections of the wall. These were not cavalry engagements. They were controlled advances, measured movements toward specific points of pressure. Defenders responded with equal intensity. Arrows were loosed from elevated positions. Boiling liquids, stones, and improvised weapons were deployed against attackers attempting to approach the walls. The vertical dimension of the battle, height versus exposure, favored the defenders, but only as long as the walls remained intact. The first breaches did not lead to immediate entry. They created contested zones. When sections of the wall began to fail under sustained bombardment, openings formed, not wide enough for full-scale invasion, but sufficient for infiltration attempts. These gaps became focal points of combat. Mongol units advanced into them, only to be met by concentrated defensive force. Fighting became localized, no longer defined by open-field maneuver. The battle fragmented into multiple points of engagement. Each breach, each weakened section of wall, became its own battlefield. Commanders on both sides struggled to maintain awareness of the overall situation as the conflict dispersed into smaller, more chaotic engagements. Within these spaces, the psychological nature of combat shifted. Visibility was limited. Noise was constant. Orders, once clear and structured, became difficult to transmit across the urban environment. Soldiers operated with incomplete information, reacting to immediate threats rather than coordinated strategy. For the defenders, this created moments of temporary advantage. They knew the terrain. They understood the layout of streets, the positioning of structures, the routes that could be used to move forces quickly between sectors. In close quarters, this familiarity compensated for the broader strategic disadvantage. But it could not compensate indefinitely. The Mongols began to exploit the internal structure of the city. Once footholds were established within outer defensive layers, the focus shifted inward. Instead of attempting to capture the entire city at once, they advanced in segments, isolating districts, cutting internal lines of movement, preventing defenders from reinforcing one another effectively. This was not a single assault. It was a gradual division. Each captured section reduced the space available to the defenders. Each loss compressed their positions, increasing density, increasing pressure on supplies, increasing the difficulty of coordination. And with compression came escalation. Fires began to appear. Some were accidental, the result of bombardment, of structures collapsing under impact. Others were deliberate. Fire, in an urban environment, was not merely destructive. It was strategic. It forced movement. It denied shelter. It created chaos that could be exploited. Smoke filled the air, reducing visibility further, complicating communication. Civilians, already confined within the city, became additional variables in the conflict. Their presence restricted movement, created congestion, and added to the strain on resources. The defenders were no longer operating in a controlled defensive posture. They were managing a collapsing environment. Outside the walls, the Mongol command continued to adjust. The initial disagreements between Joki and Chagatai did not disappear, but they became less relevant as the structure of the siege evolved. The battle was no longer about how to approach the city. It was about how to finish it. OGDI played a stabilizing role in this process, coordinating efforts to ensure that pressure remained constant across all sectors. The objective was not speed alone, it was inevitability. Inside Urgench, inevitability began to take shape as a physical reality. Defensive lines that had once been clearly defined became fluid. Positions were lost, retaken, and lost again. The concept of a front line blurred as Mongol units penetrated deeper into the city's structure. Combat moved from walls to streets. Narrow passages became sites of confrontation. Buildings were contested, occupied, abandoned. The verticality of urban space, rooftops, upper floors, introduced new dimensions to the fighting. Archers repositioned constantly, seeking vantage points that could be maintained only briefly before being compromised. And through it all, coordination eroded. Without centralized command, without reliable communication, the defenders increasingly operated as isolated groups. Courage remained. Resistance continued. But it was no longer unified. The Mongols recognized this. Their strategy adjusted once more. Not overwhelm resistance in a single moment, but to accelerate its fragmentation. Units were directed to sever connections between defensive pockets. Routes that allowed movement between districts were targeted. Bridges over canals were destroyed or captured. Passageways became contested choke points. The city, once a coherent defensive structure, began to break apart internally. Each segment fought its own battle. Each segment, eventually, faced the same outcome. And as the Mongols advanced deeper into Urgench, the nature of the conflict changed again. This was no longer a siege in the traditional sense. It had become something closer to systematic elimination. The defenders still held positions. They still resisted, but the conditions under which that resistance could succeed had already begun to disappear. And with each passing hour, the space in which they could fight continued to shrink. By the time the final phase began, there was no single moment that marked it, no signal, no decisive breakthrough that clearly separated resistance from collapse. Instead, the city reached a point where continuation itself became unsustainable. The defenders were still fighting, but no longer as a coordinated force. What had once been a structured defense had fragmented into isolated resistance pockets, each operating without awareness of the others, each reacting to immediate pressure rather than a shared plan. In these conditions, collapse does not occur all at once. It spreads. At first, it appears as localized failure, one district unable to hold, one defensive position abandoned under pressure. Then another. The pattern is not always visible from within, but its effect is cumulative. Each loss alters the balance, not just physically, but psychologically. The idea of holding begins to disappear. Inside Urgench, this transition was gradual, but irreversible. Supplies had been strained from the beginning. Now they were failing. Food distribution became uneven, then insufficient. Water access, disrupted by both damage and Mongol control of surrounding channels, became unreliable. Exhaustion accumulated, not just among soldiers, but across the entire population confined within the city. Fatigue is not only physical, it affects judgment. Decisions that once required deliberation became reactive. Units that might have repositioned under earlier conditions now remained fixed, unable to move without risking collapse elsewhere. Others withdrew prematurely, creating gaps that could not be filled. The structural resistance unraveled not because it was abandoned, but because it could no longer be maintained. Outside, the Mongol forces did not accelerate recklessly. They tightened. Their movements became more deliberate, more controlled. Where earlier phases had required adaptation and experimentation, this phase required consistency. Pressure was applied evenly, without pause, ensuring that no defensive pocket could recover or reorganize. This was not chaos. It was compression. As the remaining defenders were pushed inward, the physical space of the city contracted. Streets that had once allowed maneuver became congested. Open areas became contested zones. Movement became increasingly difficult, not only because of enemy presence, but because of the density of people, debris, and destruction. The battlefield was no longer defined by lines. It was defined by proximity. Combat occurred at distances where reaction time was minimal. Engagements were immediate, often without warning. Soldiers encountered opponents not as part of planned maneuvers, but as sudden obstacles within a collapsing environment. In such conditions, discipline remains, but coordination fades. The Mongols, however, maintained structure. Their units operated within a system that did not rely on centralized visibility at every moment. Orders had been established in advance, objectives defined clearly. Even as individual engagements became fragmented, the broader direction remained intact. This asymmetry became decisive. For the defenders, each group fought its own battle. For the attackers, each group contributed to the same outcome. The final defensive concentrations formed near the core of the city, areas where fortifications, however damaged, still provided some degree of protection. These positions were not chosen strategically in the traditional sense. They were the last places where resistance could still be organized at all. But organization alone was no longer enough. The Mongols did not attempt a single overwhelming assault on these final positions. Instead, they continued the method that had brought them this far: division, isolation, reduction. Each remaining pocket was encircled, cut off from neighboring positions, and subjected to sustained pressure. Reinforcement between these pockets was no longer possible. Communication, already degraded, effectively ceased. What remained was persistence. Defenders continued to fight, not because they expected to reverse the outcome, but because there was no alternative. Surrender, where it had been attempted in earlier cities, had not produced consistent survival. Resistance, even in its final form, was a continuation of the only option that remained viable in uncertainty. But persistence without support cannot be sustained indefinitely. One by one, these final positions were overcome, not through sudden breakthroughs, but through attrition, through the gradual erosion of manpower, of morale, of physical capacity to continue. Each engagement reduced the defenders further, until resistance at that point could no longer be maintained.